Hi, I'm Finn, and in this Sociology Explained video, I'm going to be going through the next part of the processes of education section of the Paper 1 AQA A Level Sociology. So this section particularly is about labelling and teacher expectations and their kind of impact as a process within education. So as I do this, as always, I'm going to be going through these notes that are a part of the Sociology Explained revision notes that are available on our website, sociologyexplained.co.uk. So the kind of context of this part of the paper, you'll have heard of labelling already in the course, as it will have come up when looking at differences in achievement, particularly in relation to class and ethnicity. It's there. So the context of labelling is essentially labelling as a process within schools where teachers and other members of staff, for example, they make assumptions about students, often drawing on things to do with class, gender, and race. And some sociologists have argued that this can have a big impact on how students perform in school or how they behave in schools. And there's also differences in opinion among sociologists about how labelling impacts students. Some sociologists argue that it leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is essentially the argument that sort of the labels applied to students become reality, and those students sort of live out those labels. Whereas other sociologists have focused on how students can reject labels and sort of shape their own identity beyond the labels applied by teachers. So here you can pause the video if you want to have a look at that labelling in 100 words, which is just obviously a very quick, concise summary of what labelling is in education. So the first key scholar you should be aware of for this topic is Robert Merton, who was writing in 1968, and he kind of came up with the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is a concept that is a kind of psychological concept that you can see the diagram there of how it works, and it's essentially the idea that someone's expectation of another person can affect how that person will ultimately behave and will shape their ultimate behaviour. Merton wasn't writing specifically about education, but it's his understanding of the self-fulfilling prophecy that has kind of inspired a lot of sociological understandings of labelling in education. He gave the example of a bank, and he said that if lots of people are scared about a bank being about to crash, they'll withdraw their money, which will lead to the bank crashing, even if it wasn't going to crash already. So the idea there is that someone's belief about something will kind of become true because of that belief, even if it's not necessarily true in the first place. So you could, of course, apply that to education by suggesting that if a student is made to believe that they are going to fail, they then ultimately will behave like they're going to fail, so they will fail. And applying Merton's work is Rosenthal and Jacobson, who wrote the Pygmalion in the Classroom. The self-fulfilling prophecy might come up in exams as the Pygmalion effect, it's sometimes called, and this is because of Rosenthal and Jacobson's study that applies Merton's work. So their research methods, which is something to be aware of, obviously for methods in context, is they studied a primary school in California, and what they did is they identified 20% of their class at random, and they identified them as spurters, and told teachers that spurters, these students that they selected randomly, were going to be the students that would excel. And they then saw how teachers would treat these students. They returned back to the school in a year's time, and they found that 47%, so nearly half of the students who had been labelled as spurters, had made significant progress in the classroom, which suggested that the attitudes that teachers held about a student had a big impact on how well the students were able to achieve. People have criticised this research, suggesting that it's quite deterministic, and while it shows a correlation between labelling students and their progress, so it shows that there is sort of the lines move together, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is causing the other. This study doesn't prove definitively that labelling leads to progress or vice versa. You could argue that this view of education and the self-fulfilling prophecy is still relevant, though, by looking at a recent House of Lords political discussion about a crisis of male underachievement, as it's so called, which feminist scholars have argued would lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy where boys come to believe they are disadvantaged in the current education system, and so they will disengage, which may exacerbate trends in male underachievement. So the strengths of this approach. So the self-fulfilling prophecy is a really widely understood and widely cited concept in sociology, not just in education, but across the board in other topics such as crime, religion, etc. And so therefore is a very deemed to be quite a strong approach to sociology. However, Marxist sociologists, for example, have been critical of this approach to sociology, viewing it as focusing too much on sort of specific interactions and blaming teachers too much, while kind of turning somewhat a blind eye to wider structural factors such as class, Marxists would say. And there you can bring in Roger Dale as a critic who argues that labelling theory focuses too much on small-scale social interactions rather than wider social issues. So the next key scholar to be aware of is Howard Becker, who wrote in 1971, and here he wrote Outsiders, Studies in the Sociology of Deviance. So he was particularly looking at deviant behaviour and how that arises. So that's something, again, that you could maybe apply to not just education, but also to later topics that will come up. But his research method for his study is that he interviewed 60 teachers in Chicago, and he used sort of informal interview methods, switching between kind of blunt interviewing and sort of more charming and long form interviews to try and get the most out of the teachers he was interviewing. And of course, just as a sort of methods in context moment, which is obviously part of the exam you'll have in paper 1, you could think about the ethical concerns of that. Before we go into the argument there, you could think about the fact that there's impression management taking place, so many teachers might not want to be completely honest about how they may label or may not label students because it might not be good for their image. Labelling also might be more of a covert practice, and not something that will be spoken about explicitly by teachers. Students also may be unwilling to discuss how they feel about labelling, due to not wanting to sort of speak out against the teacher, and they could get in trouble, they might fear. And also the fact that teachers simply could get in sort of trouble at work if they admitted to doing something like labelling. But at the same time, this interviewing method did allow for kind of a qualitative approach to labelling, and to see sort of the reasons why this might happen. But of course, also you could argue that it's not sort of a generalisable study. But of course, classrooms also do provide sort of an intimate space where interactions can be observed closely, which provides kind of good information for a researcher. But Becker's argument ultimately is that teachers form judgments on students based on assumptions rather than necessarily just their academic ability. So he argued that teachers often form labels based on assumptions about their students' class background. So this is something in particular that comes up in that differences in class differences in achievement section. So he found that teachers often judge students according to a kind of image of what an ideal student was. And he viewed this ideal student, or the idea of the ideal student in the teacher's imagination, as sort of a middle class stereotype, essentially. They had sort of middle class values, sort of vocabulary that was deemed middle class. They were often white. They sort of presented in a middle class way in the way they showed intellectual curiosity, the way they spoke, etc. And he essentially found that all students were judged against this benchmark of an ideal pupil, and teachers therefore treated students differently. So if they deemed a student close to the ideal pupil, so this would tend to be white middle class students, teachers would give them extension work, give them higher books to read, or put them in higher streams in class, for example. Whereas working class pupils, who are often deemed not to fit this sort of ideal pupil archetype, were often deemed incompetent and underachievers from the offset. They'd be put at the back of the class and kind of ignored by teachers. So you can develop Becker's idea with the work of Ray Rist, who found that in 1970, his study found that teachers from an early age, their judgment was influencing how students related to school and how they perceived their own kind of competence and achievement in schools. So he sort of identified two particular judgments and responses to judgments. One was the kind of clown, or the kind of class clown is the classic saying, which was often he deemed working class students who were put at the back of the class and kind of ignored by teachers, both for negative behaviour, so they weren't disciplined properly, but they were also ignored for any positive input in the lessons as well, and they were overall given far fewer opportunities to succeed. And then there were the tigers, who were students who were generally middle class, fast learners, and teachers deemed them probably closer to what Becker's ideal pupil was, and they were regularly given positive feedback. They were also invited to extra interaction with parents, and these students came to see themselves as high flyers, sort of success stories within the schools, and this kind of reinforced their success in school. So how can you kind of evaluate this idea? You could bring in Wong et al. As a study to support this work, who found that evidence that the ideal pupil, as in 2021, is still an idea that persists into higher education, but it changes in higher education, where higher education is even more marketized. The idea of the ideal pupil increasingly reflects sort of the economic insecurities of students, and it's sort of more realistic and imperfect. So while it's different, Wong still found that in higher education, the ideal student does create kind of implicit and hidden rules that disadvantages certain students in education. However, you could argue that teacher training is perhaps putting a stop to this, because teachers are made increasingly aware of things like unconscious bias, and they're increasingly trained not to stereotype and to label students. Furthermore, there's obviously a more diverse range of teachers these days than perhaps there was in the 70s when Becker was writing. And this more diverse range of teachers might mean that there's less labelling going on. There's less only white teachers sort of applying their white middle class labels to students. And Amelia Hempel-Jorgensen is also a good critic to bring in here, as she says that the ideal pupil as an idea is not something that stays stationary, but instead it's always changing depending on the demographics of schools. So, for example, in a largely working class primary school, she found that the ideal pupil was someone who was quiet and passive and kind of obedient, where in a largely middle class primary school with less discipline issues, the ideal pupil was someone who was kind of had more of a personality and was pushing for more academic achievement. And that kind of undermines the idea, particularly when you're thinking about this in terms of patterns of achievement and how it maybe explains ethnic or class patterns. It shows that this is something that's changing all the time and kind of can't be generalized as a process within schools to explain certain patterns. So the next key scholar is Gilbourne and Mirza, who were writing in 2000, particularly thinking about race, class and gender. Their study essentially found that black children were amongst the highest achievers in primary school, around 20% above average at the time. However, they would often leave with some of the worst GCSE results compared to any other ethnic group. So upon this data, they suggested that this shows that there's clearly something happening within schools that's leading to this achievement decreasing at quite a steep level. And they particularly stressed labelling as a reason for this, and particularly labelling based on racism as a reason for this. They similarly kind of drew on ideas of the ideal pupil and sort of racist labels attached to black students that leads to them feeling like they can't succeed in education or that education isn't for them. And you can have a pause here and look at this more detailed graph that compares the labelling of black students perhaps to the labelling of Asian students, for example. And you can look at Cecil Wright's study of how Asian pupils are also often labelled by white teachers, particularly in multi-ethnic primary schools. And Shane in 2003 looks at how Asian pupils are perhaps disciplined more harshly when they misbehave. But it's of course worth thinking also about how those different ethnic groups maybe respond differently to labelling, or thinking about how or why it is that if both students receive labelling, why some statistically perform better in education, or maybe if it's different labels and that kind of thing. So you can support Gilbourne and Mirza's work with Peter Foster, 1990, who particularly linked teacher labelling to setting and streaming, and found that black students were often labelled as behaving badly in schools, which led to them being put in lower sets at school, which kind of capped the exams they were able to take, etc., and would result in lower self-esteem, and it kind of also had this self-fulfilling prophecy effect. But you could also criticise the work with the work of Margaret Fuller, who was writing in 1984, and her research of black girls at London Comprehensive School found that a lot of these girls labelled as low achievers by the school rejected these labels and worked extra hard to kind of prove that they were wrong. So that sort of challenges the idea that labelling leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, or that labelling necessarily has a big impact on students. So that's all the kind of key stuff you need to know for this topic. As I said, you can always also look back on those differences in achievement videos for some more similar content on this part of the course. But you could also obviously be asked questions on this topic alone, so it's worth understanding in depth. So I hope that was helpful. If it was, go to Sociology Explained website to have a look at those notes along with essay plans and more.